I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we continue our investigation into the mystery of the Khamar Daban. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my Sharivna co-host, Alice.
That was beautiful, Brett. What language is that?
That is Ukrainian. It means magical. Ukrainian in honor of the kayakers who found Volya. They were actually Ukrainian, so perfect. And in honor of you, Alice, who are magical, of course.
That's a great word. You're getting really good at these not English words.
You know, Alice, people heard the last episode, so I don't know that you can pull the wool over their eyes on that one.
I'm trying.
This one's nice. It's only 3 syllables, so.
I was gonna say, I think maybe under septisyllabic, you're good.
Exactly. I try. Yeah. You know, Alice, I mean, the thing you should always remember about these words is that somebody out there thinks you are, besides me, thinks you are, in this case, magical. I mean, that has to make you feel good, right?
Or they just want to hear you say the word.
Well, there is that. There's definitely some people who do that, and that's okay, too. But as long as they apply to you, we are always happy to use them. Well, we are so excited to be back with you guys, continuing our look into this crazy mystery. Just to remind you where we are in Russia. We're in the Khamar Daban, a mountain range in Irkutsk, close to Lake Baikal. And we have a number of hikers who have gone up and met a mysterious and tragic end, not unlike what we saw at Dyatlov Pass. But the strangest thing about this may be that there is a survivor, and the story that she tells is one that is kind of crazy. Just to remind you of what we discussed last time, essentially, these hikers had spent the night on the side of a mountain. It was very cold and rainy. By the time they woke up that day, it was actually snowing, and they decided that the better course of action than trying to continue up the mountain was actually to just go ahead and go down the hill, down the mountain to the forest. But not 10 minutes after they began this descent, one of the older members of the group and one of the leaders of the group collapsed to the ground, and according to the one survivor, he was bleeding from his nose and from his eyes and his ears. And the leader of the group, who saw this young man as a son, sort of fell upon him and told the others to keep going, that she wasn't going to leave his side. But very soon, she was overcome by very similar illness. The rest of the group rushed up to try and help them, but one by one, they succumbed to the same whatever force was acting upon the group, and they were bleeding, and blood was coming out of their eyes, and they were foaming at the mouth. And the only person who survived was this one young girl named Valya, who made it down to the forest, only to return the next day to collect some supplies and a map and a compass, and her friends were all dead. And the last thing she did for them was close their eyes. And this has led many people to wonder, what in the world happened on the side of that mountain? We went through the timeline with you last week, and this week we're going to sort of dive into the details and talk about the theories. A couple things to point out about this hike. Number one, they were probably at least halfway through the hike when this happened. They had actually already climbed a higher mountain by the time they got to the slope of the mountain where many of them would lose their lives. So this was not even the most difficult part of this hike. And this was a difficult hike, but it wasn't the hardest hike. It was somewhere in the middle. So difficult, but not maybe as difficult as some of the other hikes this group had been on, and certainly maybe what the Dyatlov group was doing. So that adds even more sort of a mystery to how this all went down. And that is not the only unusual factor. And let's start with what the group was eating. So a journalist looked into this, and that journalist has been very helpful. We've read a lot of the stuff he wrote about this. His name was Vladimir Zerov. I actually reached out to him on Facebook, but he never responded. I'm pretty sure his Facebook page is in Russian, so I don't even know if he speaks English. But in any event, he did not get back to us, unfortunately. But he was a journalist, an outdoorsman, and he did a deep dive on this case. In fact, going so far as to retrace the footsteps of the group to try and understand what happened to them. And one of the interesting things he reported was that the food the group was eating simply was not up to the hike. It was not enough to replace the energy they were losing. And it might have been fine if everything went according to plan, but remember, you had the cold, which was unexpected. And if you're exercising or engaged in strenuous activity outside when it's cold, your body is obviously having to burn even more calories to both keep you warm and to do whatever the physical activity is that you're trying to do. Moreover, there was extra weight in their gear because everything was soaked. And those of you who've done these kind of really complex hikes before, you know that weight matters. And the amount of weight that you're carrying on your back matters. And it's one of those things you calculate pretty precisely. You're not taking a lot of extra stuff. And water weighs a lot. And they had this soaked gear. They are in cold weather, which they didn't really expect. And for whatever reason, they just didn't have enough food. Now, Valia had said in one of her interviews that they were eating about 2,500 calories a day, which sounds like enough, but apparently it wasn't. According to Vladimir, the amount of food they were eating would have only been enough for what he called, or at least the translation described, as external heating. So it's sort of keeping them going and maybe keeping them above some level of hypothermia, but it's not enough that they're fully recovering their energy when they're eating this. And in fact, the autopsies that were done on the hikers seem to confirm this, as they all found the hikers to have a significant protein deficiency.
You know, Brett, when I first heard this, I thought, how could it be? How could it just be that what they were eating was not enough, could cause such kind of devastation? But then I thought too, an experience that maybe many of us have witnessed before. If you've ever watched a marathon, whether on TV or you went to go watch a race or you ran a marathon yourself, kind of inevitably there will be a runner or another runner who has to be carried off, like on stretcher or by other runners, off of the course because their bodies have completely given up, right? They didn't gauge their caloric intake enough so that around, mile 21, 22, 23, what have you, their legs quite literally buckle beneath them and they kind of look like jelly people, right? We see this at the Olympics. The Olympics were, very recent this summer. Their entire body, they seem to lose faculties of them, and you know that the person you're watching is actually an incredibly fit and able-bodied person regularly, but here they are looking like kind of a jelly man because their bodies just do not have anything to burn. Think about a fire that's burning. If there are no logs, if there's no kindling, the fire just kind of extinguishes. And that's what kind of happens in your body when you do not have enough to keep it going. And these are more extreme conditions than they were even prepared for. If this was August, they didn't expect it to be quite so cold, quite so wet, for their bodies to have to be working so hard to just reach baseline temperature.
And I actually witnessed this happen once to one of my friends. When I was in law school, I had a friend who was a very good runner and had run several marathons, had run the Manhattan Marathon or the New York City Marathon, whatever they call it, several times, and had qualified for the Boston Marathon. And the Boston Marathon that year, it was colder than it usually was. And those of you who know anything about the Boston Marathon know that there's sort of this last part. I think they call it like Heartbreak Hill. It's like this hill at the very end of the marathon. So you've already ran like 25 miles and you've got to run this very last part. And they had people on the side who were watching runners for exactly what you're describing. And she unfortunately had that happen to her where she got towards the end and she was showing signs of hypothermia. Even though she was running, she didn't have enough energy, or she had not been eating enough to keep her core temperature up. And they actually did exactly what you're saying. They went out and they grabbed her and sort of took her off the course, which was really tough for her because she was in great shape. She was in perfect shape, all the training, but all of that didn't matter when it came to the point of what you're describing. It was simply too cold, and she did not have enough energy to keep herself warm and to continue to run. Those of you who watch the Tour de France every year, I'm actually a big fan of the Tour de France. We watch it every year. And the Tour de France is another instance in which you simply do not have enough energy to complete the Tour de France unless you are constantly eating. So if you're watching it, it's weird. They go through these things called feed stations where they grab bags of food and they're riding their bikes on these 100-mile rides and they're constantly eating. And they're drinking a Coke and they're eating a candy bar or whatever because they have to sort of keep their energy up. And you just have to wonder, with all of the energy that they were expending and not being able to build a fire that night before and the constant rain and the constant cold, if they were in a situation like you're describing where their bodies simply have run out of fuel and they're operating at a very low level, which is incredibly dangerous considering the circumstances they are in.
And what's interesting, all of that planning out your food, you're right. When I used to train for marathons, I would, on my long runs on the weekend, I would hide bags of, energy bars or quite literally gummy bears, because I love gummy bears, in the bushes along my path at the points in which I knew I would need them, right? Like mile marker 12 and 16 and whatnot. And I could grab into the bushes like a bottle of water or an energy bar. They don't have that here. They have just what's on their backs. And there's no kind of reaching into a bush, metaphorically, to grab some extra energy bars. But one thing I will note is weird is, I trained for these races in groups. And so sometimes the running group would be 2 people. Sometimes it would be 20 people. It would be rare for all of us to reach this point. If all of us were to kind of reach Jellyman status in a race or even in training. And while these people have been traveling together for quite some time, so even if one person would have succumbed, and maybe all of them would have succumbed eventually, it's strange that they all succumbed within minutes of each other. That is strange to me because this phenomenon operates differently for different people. Everyone has different BMI, body masses, different metabolic levels, and different statuses of what they're intaking. At this point, when we're talking about the difference between being able to take that extra step or your body just giving out, it depends on so many factors. And for their bodies all to give out due to lack of calories at the almost exact same time is a little bit strange to me.
Yeah, I'll say 2 things about that, and then we can move on. The first thing is, I think you're 100% right, and we're going to keep seeing this as we go through this. No matter what theory you come up with and how good it sounds, you keep running into this problem of the fact that all of them seem to succumb to the same thing at the same time, despite the fact they are different ages. It's both men and women from 15 years old to 40 years old, despite the fact that they are in different physical conditions. And yet this does seem to strike them all at the same time. And the second thing I'll say is, of course, Alice, you're a marathoner. Yet another thing about Alice that we learn on the podcast.
I don't think it's fair to call me a marathoner if I haven't run many, many marathons. In my younger days, I could do it. But I'm sure there are people listening right now who are like, they're such good marathon runners that they've never faced the situation that I'm describing. So I can be a jack of all trades, master of none.
Well, you're definitely a jack of all trades.
A mediocre jack of all trades. Brett, I am so excited that the Prosecutors podcast is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you get a great rate on car insurance, even if it's not with them. They have this nifty comparison tool that puts rates side by side, so you choose a rate and coverages that work for you. So let's say you're interested in lowering your rate on your car insurance. Visit progressive.com to get a quote with all the coverages you want. You'll see Progressive's rate, and then their tool will provide options from other companies, all lined up and easy to compare, so that all you have to do is choose the rate and coverages you like. Progressive gives you options so you can make the best choice for you. You could be looking forward to saving money in the very near future. More money for, say, a pair of noise-canceling headphones, an Instapot, I love mine, more puzzles, whatever brings you joy. Get a quote today at progressive.com. It's one small step you can do today that could make a big impact on your budget tomorrow. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. Anyways, back to the case. Another thing to discuss is the decision to camp on the side of the mountain. Now, of all the decisions made by the group, the one that has confounded those investigating the case from the beginning is, why did they decide to camp on the side of the mountain? It's an eerie parallel to Dyatlov Pass, where the decision to camp on the side of the mountain probably cost the group's life in Dyatlov Pass. Some have asked why. If the situation had become so dire, didn't the group simply head back down the mountain to the safety of the tree line? Yet others have wondered why they didn't push on the last few hundred feet to the summit, where they could have found shelter and supplies. Remember, there were extra supplies housed at the summit. But the answer actually seems pretty straightforward. They were cold. They were beat down. They were exhausted. Ludmilla would have recognized this in her charges, and she must have decided that the danger of continuing in either direction was simply outweighed by their need to stop. The area was not one that suffered rock slides or avalanches, and obviously the group survived the night. So it wasn't a terrible decision on Ludmilla's part if she looked around and saw kind of the exhaustion and, need to stop in all of their faces. But it's also obvious that they got very little rest or recovery from their decision to stop. The question is, did this stop on the side of the mountain contribute to their sudden death the next day?
And I think the last part is the most interesting, because people have questioned this a lot, but it really feels like a lot of sort of 2020 hindsight second guessing to me, because imagine a situation in which they had stopped on the side of the mountain. Maybe they were able to get a fire together. They get in the tents. They don't have all the problems they had that night. Remember, 2 different times they had to get up in the middle of the night and go out into the freezing rain to fix the tent, because they had a line that broke. The tent's like coming up. It's no longer moored to the side of the mountain. They're having to fix the tent. So they're not getting much rest. Water's pouring into the tent because of these problems. They're also getting soaking wet when they go back out there. If that hadn't happened, if the tent had stayed secured and they had actually got a good night's rest, then who knows? Then maybe this seems like a really good idea and it accomplishes what it seems obvious Ludmilla wanted to accomplish. But I also just don't think they had a choice. I think we talked about this a little bit before. If one of them or more than one of them were just like, I cannot go on, I can't go up one step and I can't go down one step. Here is where I make my stand, as it were, If that was the case, I think she just had to stop, and there was nothing she could do about it. So I know people question this a lot, and this is something that comes up again and again in the literature, but to me, I think you're right. I just don't think it's as much of a mystery as maybe some people make it out to be.
Yeah, it's hard to judge, especially when you throw in the elements, right? It's easy for me in my warm, cozy closet right now to think, just push on. What's a couple more feet? What's a couple more hours? But they're days in. She has some young charges, right? Teenagers with her. And she has to be encouraging to the whole group this entire time. This isn't the last day of the hike. They still have days ahead of them. And so team morale, group morale is still something she has to keep in mind as well.
So let's talk about hypothermia. We've danced around this a lot. Hypothermia is the avalanche theory of this case. It's the official position of the Russian government, who ruled the case to be an accident and ruled cause of death to be hypothermia for all of these folks. And I spent some time sort of pouring through the medical journals on hypothermia, and I can't find anything where hypothermia causes the kind of sudden, violent death described by Valia. In fact, induced hypothermia is sometimes used to slow catastrophic bleeding, as the lowered pulse leads to less blood loss. But causing bleeding, especially from the eyes, the ears, the nose, that just doesn't seem to be a symptom of hypothermia. Neither is the sudden inability to breathe. So although hypothermia fits with so much of what we said, with the fact that they're not getting enough food, with the fact that it's so cold, with the fact that they're wet, hypothermia fits with all of that. But what it doesn't fit with are the actual symptoms that our witness seems to have seen occurring in the group.
Right. I mean, medically speaking, doctors use lowering patients' body temperatures to slow down whenever you have like traumatic injuries, right? And your body needs time to catch up. They talk about kind of these induced comas where they put your body into a lower temperature to slow everything down, and then they slowly raise your temperature to bring you back. And that's what usually you think of hypothermia, slowing things down, not this. This seems like a horror movie, to be honest, like a zombie movie where everything strikes, whether it's internal, external, it's not clear, but traumatic things are happening to you. That's not what the cold typically does to a body.
No, that's right. I'm trying to even, it's like one of those scenes from 28 Days Later. Those of you who've seen 28 Days Later, where the infected, they have this disease, and that's the way the disease is passed, is they're just bleeding all over the place. And that's sort of what this seems like. It does not seem like something, it certainly does not seem like hypothermia. And let me also say this, even if hypothermia is the ultimate cause of death, I mean, you could imagine a circumstance in which hypothermia is what kills them. It is not what started this, or it doesn't seem like it. Even if it knocked them out, whatever happened knocked them out, and they're laying on the ground because of whatever happened, and then they die of hypothermia, that doesn't tell you much. It's kind of like saying, the cause of death is always the when your heart stops, or, or when your brain dies from lack of oxygen, but that doesn't actually tell you anything about what caused that condition. And I kind of feel like maybe that's what we have here. Even if, as a technicality, hypothermia is the ultimate cause of death, I don't think it's the proximate cause of death.
And, we've seen hypothermia-induced deaths, but they're typically where everyone's asleep and they fall asleep and die. Like the hiker, who they die in their sleeping bag zipped up because hypothermia makes you very, very sleepy because your body's slowing down and is trying to conserve energy. It can't keep warm. So in order to conserve all the energy to keep your body temperature above a level that can sustain life, your body just stops moving, and then eventually you fall asleep and then never wake up. And that's why if you find hikers who have died from hypothermia, they're usually like in their tent. They look like they're sleeping or in a sleeping position rather than standing upright and then all of a sudden keel over from hypothermia, right?
And we saw that in Dyatlov Pass, where you have the 3 people who are trying to go back up to the tent. And it seems pretty clear that, each one of them, kind of like what you were saying, had a different tolerance for it. And, the 3 of them are making their way back up, one in a row. And then one by one, they just sort of fall down and die of hypothermia. And that you could expect. But, none of those people, Dyatlov didn't have blood pouring out of his nose, Xena didn't have blood pouring out of her nose. I mean, Rustam, none of these, that's not what happens when you die of hypothermia. So I don't know. It does not fit what we're hearing from the one person who's left alive.
Brett, before we move on, I have to say there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to hair care. A product that works wonders for curls might make straight hair limp and greasy. I know that my hair, I have to run to court and look professional at all times, but with small children, sometimes I just grab whatever is closest to me and it just doesn't cut it with my hair. But thanks to my personalized Prose routine, I can honestly say I've never been more in love with my hair. Prose makes custom hair care that's effective because it's personal, using natural ingredients with proven results. Prose customizes every product in your routine, from shampoo to supplements. First, Prose starts by asking about you as a person with their in-depth consultation. Prose asked me really unexpected things like my level of exercise and my eating habits, things that would help them better care for my hair. Next, Prose analyzed all my answers and determined what unique blend of ingredients should be in every product of my custom routine. Together, Prose got all my hair goals covered. I love their customized conditioner because it leaves my hair so smooth and shiny. As a carbon-neutral certified B Corp, Prose is an industry leader in clean and responsible beauty. All their ingredients are sustainably sourced, ethically gathered, and cruelty-free. They're also the first custom beauty brand to go carbon neutral. If you're not 100% positive Prose is the best hair care for you, they will take the products back, no questions asked. Prose is the healthy hair regimen with your name all over it. Take your free in-depth hair consultation and get 15% off your first order today. Go to prose.com/prosecute. That's PROSE.com/prosecute for your free in-depth hair consultation and 15% off.
Now, there are some interesting things about the bodies, specifically injuries to the lungs. The autopsies of the bodies showed something inexplicable. Their lungs were bruised. Almost always, bruised lungs are caused by some sort of impact, either blunt trauma or a concussion caused by an explosion. But although either of those things might be expected in, say, the Dyatlov Pass case, there is no evidence at all that any of the hikers here suffered this kind of injury. So, how did all of their lungs get bruised? And again, not just one of them, but all of them showed bruising on the lungs. That I don't think can be attributed to hypothermia.
Yeah, and when I was trying to read about hypothermia and see if, maybe the fact that you're breathing in such cold air will bruise your lungs. But no, I didn't see any of that. So I don't know. There are times I wish that we had a doctor on this podcast because it would be nice to be able to ask somebody who's a little bit of a professional.
We have very smart listeners who are medically trained, who write us great things. So I actually would like someone to explain this to us. If it's not hypothermia, what can cause all of the deceased to have these injuries on their lungs that looks like it's from blunt force?
Yeah, so hopefully if there is somebody out there who knows the answer to that, you'll let us know, because it's one of those things we can talk about, but I can't even begin to explain why that would be the case. And it's just another one of these unusual factors about this case. And another thing that's unusual and that raises all sorts of questions and makes you ask all sorts of questions is why it took so long to start this search. So despite what Valia had told the authorities, so she's told them, my friends and I were hiking up this mountain. 7 of us are dead. They died this horrible way. They are on the side of the mountain. This is basically where they are. It took 2 weeks for the search to begin. Not 2 weeks to find them. 2 weeks for the search to even start. Now, why did it take so long? This is not a situation, the weather hadn't gotten really bad. It's not one of those things where they have to wait for the storm to pass. This is not an inaccessible place where they have to have a helicopter to go up there. They could have gone up and done this search earlier, and there's no reason ever given by the authorities for why it took so long. And by the time they got up there, it was obvious that animals had gotten to the bodies. There were a lot of things you just couldn't tell. I mean, even this sort of the presence of all this blood, by that time, there's not going to be as much evidence of that because of all the different kinds of scavengers that would have attacked the bodies. There's video of the finding of the bodies. It's edited and blurred out. Apparently, those who've seen the unedited version say, I mean, these people had just been completely eviscerated by scavengers. So there probably was a lot of information that was lost because it took them so long to start. Now, I think you can never discount the fact that this did happen in Russia in the late 1980s. There was a lot going on in Russia at the time. They weren't exactly the best put together, organized government at the time or even now. So there's always that possibility that they just couldn't get their act together. But it's not like Moscow had to decide this, right? I mean, this was a local thing. They could have sent some people up there. There were two groups of hikers on the side of the mountain. Another group could have gone up, but it didn't. It took them 2 weeks for the search to begin. And to me, that's a red flag.
Yeah, that was one of the things that stood out most to me when we were talking about the timeline. These kayakers find this woman who is washing her hair in the middle of the lake, and she tells them, all of my friends, all of my, co-hikers are dead. You would think there'd be like an automatic search because those people have families who are wondering where they are. Usually, I mean, in our experience in law enforcement, if the report is there are dead people, the next response isn't, well, they're already dead, we don't have to hurry. That's usually not the response. The response is we have to go, right away, because if they are in fact already dead, I mean, we have to bring them back for their families because of what you've just said, deterioration of the bodies. Usually there's no difference in law enforcement response to someone still breathing or they're dead. Usually the response is, we're on it right away. And when I was reading the timeline, I even think I said that in the last episode. I was like, that's a really long time to wait before you kind of dispatch the searchers.
Yeah, and some of these folks are kids, I mean, there are kids on the side of that mountain. It's not just a bunch of grizzled mountain climbers. You would think the people would want to get up there as soon as possible to recover the bodies, but for whatever reason, they did not do that.
Now, according to various reports, when the bodies were found, 3 of the victims were barefoot, while almost all of them were dressed only in thin clothing. This makes little sense, as the group would have been well dressed when they left the tent. Given that hypothermia was listed as a cause of death, paradoxical undressing is a possibility, and we've talked about this before. Paradoxical undressing is where even though you're actually very cold and you need more clothes, your body tells you you're very hot, so you paradoxically undress even though you are very cold. But paradoxical undressing doesn't make any sense if Valia's story is credited. She said she saw them all die quickly without undressing. There wasn't time to undress. Remember, each of the deaths, as recounted by Valia, they were fine, and then the next second they were either bashing in their own heads or grasping at their throats as if they couldn't breathe, and then blood was pouring out of their orifices and they died. Right? That's what she described. Nothing in that story said that while they were clutching their throats or bashing in their heads, they were also undressing and taking off shoes or outer coats. But despite these reports of undressing, they actually seem not to be true, because there is a video of hikers being found, and although it's not the most comprehensive footage, what you can see in the video is that they do seem to be wearing all their clothes and boots. So, Brett, why were there reports that they were shoeless and dressed in very thin clothing?
I think this is an example of, and we see this a lot in these historical cases, I think it's just yet another example of sensationalism and embellishing what is already a mysterious story. So you have these people who've died on the side of the mountain. Oh, and they weren't wearing any clothes and they were barefoot. So I think these stories are largely not true. And I think that's what you can chalk them up to, is just It's just there's always going to be some fog in these stories. There's always going to be some little details that may or may not be true. And I think in this case, and maybe the people who said this were even thinking about Dyatlov Pass and sort of melding the two together, like, oh, another mysterious death of people on the side of a mountain where they died suddenly and they weren't wearing any clothes, even though it was really cold. It just doesn't seem to be true. So I think this is when you can probably chalk up to that sort of sensationalism.
And I'll go, not conspiracy theory, but rather when articles are being written, we know now there's a term now called clickbait, right? There are articles written knowing that they'll just get lots of clicks because they are sensational. While the reporters at the time may not have been trying to put out false information, there probably wasn't a lot of information out there at all, right? About these hikers, about the condition of their bodies. And so if they were hearing that the official cause of death was hypothermia, they may have embellished their own facts to have more to write about. So to give their readers more to grasp onto than just kind of the cold conclusion of a report.
That's true. And if you want to go conspiracy theory, it could just be a way for the government to bolster their claim that it's hypothermia because everybody knows by this point about paradoxical undressing. So you just sort of add that layer on, and all of a sudden, people are like, oh, well, of course they didn't have any clothes on because they died of hypothermia.
That's where I was going at first, but I was trying to stay away from conspiracy theory, Brett.
Can't stay away from conspiracies when you're in Russia.
That's a fair point.
And let's talk about some conspiracies. Let's talk about some of the theories in this case, which I think will further flesh out some of the facts. And, look, you can't talk about a case like this without talking about aliens or secret government agents or military exercises gone wrong. And I think you can group all these together in this case, not because they have anything in common, but because they all seem impossible for the same reason. So remember, Dyatlov Pass, the group was pretty much on their own. They're out in the middle of nowhere. There are some people hiking, quote unquote, nearby, but we mean like 100 kilometers away. And so people saw strange things in the sky, which may relate to the case, but it's not as if they could see exactly where Dyatlov and the group were. Not the case here. As we said before, the group was on the wide open side of a mountain in the middle of the day when this tragedy struck, at a time when there were a lot of tourists around, at a time when other groups were hiking on this mountain. It's hard to believe that aliens could come down, or secret agents could strike and kill all these people, or they could stumble upon a secret military operation and no one would see it. And maybe even more problematic for any of these theories, which some people do suggest, is that Valia lived. Now, it's possible she's lying up to this day to save her own skin, afraid if she talks about the aliens or the secret agents or the military exercise that they'll come and kill her. But the other question you have to ask is, how exactly did she escape whatever befell the rest of the group? You would think if they killed everybody else, they could have hunted down this 17-year-old and taken care of her too, but they didn't do that. So I think we probably can go ahead and put these theories, as sexy as they may be, on the back burner.
But they are so sexy.
They are so sexy. So sexy.
And you guys know that we will not shy away from these types of theories if they make sense. Go listen to our Dyatlov Pass episodes, and I think you'll see what we mean. But in this case, there's just none of that point to this sort of sexy theory. Now let's talk about infrasound. As in Dyatlov Pass, some suggested that infrasound had something to do with the deaths. While it might explain bizarre behavior, however, it really doesn't explain the physical reactions that Valia described of her co-hikers. No infrasound we know of can do that. So it might lead them to do something crazy like cut their way out of a tent from the inside when the inside of the tent is much safer to be than the harsh elements of the outside. But it doesn't explain why all of a sudden they would be grasping at their throats, banging their heads against rocks, and dying kind of in dramatic fashion.
So if it's not infrasound and it's not aliens, could it be a drug overdose? Specifically, an overdose of magic mushrooms. Could the group have simply had a really, really bad trip? As we've mentioned earlier, Ludmila was a survivalist, and she used these hiking outings to teach her students how to survive in the wild, and this would have included harvesting food from the surrounding areas. And we also know that she was harvesting medicinal plants from the area, and the thought is she probably was going to sell those as they were very popular in Russia. Is it possible that while the group was hiking up this mountain, they could have got some mushrooms for breakfast, which we know they ate? We know they did eat breakfast before this happened, not realizing these weren't just standard mushrooms, but were actually psychedelic mushrooms. Now, the symptoms of an overdose on such mushrooms do include intense difficulty breathing, fear, disorientation, paranoia, agitation, hostility, and unpredictable or dangerous behavior. Now, as Alice mentioned with infrasound, the problem is none of those symptoms include bleeding from your eyes and your ears and your mouth. However, apparently, one of the hallucinations people sometimes see when they are under one of these overdoses, these intense trips from these mushrooms, is seeing people bleeding from their eyes. This is apparently a fairly common side effect. So it's possible that while this does not explain the sudden death of Sasha, but what if Sasha didn't really die? What if instead he just sort of passed out and everybody freaked out? And maybe if that were the case, they did die of hypothermia because they were in the midst of this hallucination. They were seeing these crazy things happen. They were panicking and they could not get their act together. And maybe somebody is bashing their head against a rock and they can't breathe. And it really is just a sort of mass hysteria driven by this drug they're on that leads them to stay out in the middle of this place and die. And Valia was just lucky that her reaction to this was to basically run away and get to the bottom of the mountain, where she eventually passed out in her sleeping bag. And by the time she woke up, the effects had passed for her. I don't know. Honestly, some people like this theory. One thing I would be interesting, and one thing I could not run down, is whether or not these types of mushrooms are common in that area. I found some stuff which seemed to indicate they were, but nothing concrete. So I don't know if you're into this kind of thing and you know that Lake Baikal is the place with the best magic mushrooms in the world and they're really potent. I would be interested to know that. Obviously, this is not something. This is a theory that really can only be speculative. It does explain things in a way, frankly, that very few theories do, because it explains it simply by saying it didn't actually happen. It was all just a hallucination. And this sort of dry Russian description of this being hypothermia is true. Kind of like what we were saying. Hypothermia is what killed them, but it wasn't the proximate cause. The proximate cause in this case would be this sort of mass hallucination brought on by these mushrooms.
I mean, I will say something that's attractive about this theory, while I may not adopt it in whole, is that what Valia recounts wasn't all true. And not necessarily because she's lying, but maybe because she was traumatized and misremembered, or was hallucinating and didn't actually see what she thought she saw. Because what she does tell is what we're all trying to solve, right? We're trying to find a theory that fits everything she said, but it's so difficult to find one, whether natural causes or conspiracy theory, to match it, that it causes me to call into question her recounting of the facts. Now, what if something very mundane happened, even if tragic? What if Sasha just had an aneurysm? Although extremely rare for someone his age, it's possible that Sasha suffered from an aneurysm which burst from the stress and strain of climbing the mountain. When an aneurysm bursts, death can be so sudden that people have described it as if the person was shot. One moment they are fine, and the next they are on the ground, dead. They can also cause bleeding in the brain and surrounding cavities. With nowhere to exit, The blood flows from any opening it can, in this case, maybe the eyes and mouth.
And of course, that only explains what happened to Sasha. So if it were an aneurysm, you really kind of need a string of things to have happened. So you have Sasha die of an aneurysm, and then maybe Ludmilla just dies of a heart attack. Maybe what happens here is the sudden shock of seeing Sasha die from this aneurysm causes Ludmilla to have a heart attack. Given the stress she's already under, her deep feelings for the boy, and his intensely disturbing death, I can only imagine how horrible it would be to see something like that. It's possible it was just all too much for her to bear. So you also have the cold weather here, which can dramatically increase the risk of a heart attack for those who are susceptible. We've all heard stories of people suffering heart attacks while shoveling snow. This is a similar case, with Sasha's death being the final triggering event. This theory is supported by the autopsy, which this is a little unclear because I've seen conflicting things here, but I have certainly seen autopsy reports or reports of the autopsy. This is a case where it's hard to get the actual documents, and they're in Russian, so you kind of have to depend on reporting of others, that Ludmilla did die of a heart attack, that her death is sort of the one that is different from everybody else's. Everybody else died of hypothermia, but she had a heart attack. Well, if that's true, if it's true that she died of a heart attack, and given sort of the story we're hearing from Valia, you can sort of say that these two events are connected in that way. Sasha has an extremely rare thing happen to him, which, because of the stress of it, causes sort of a domino effect. So this happens to him, and then Ludmilla, the shock and the strain of everything, suffers a heart attack as well.
And I wonder, I mean, kind of going back to my theory that Valia didn't maybe see everything she thought she saw, if in fact blood was flowing from Sasha's face, that's incredibly traumatic. And then other people die in close succession. That is very, very traumatic to witness. That maybe blood was only coming from Sasha's face and no one else's face, but you kind of in the chaos, if you're ever in a mob or a riot or something like that, you kind of mush together all the facts, like everyone had on masks or everyone had a gun or whatnot. I'm thinking about watching a kind of like a war scene in a movie where I can't quite pick out who had what because it's all chaotic.
And I think this is such an important thing. We've talked about it before in the context of criminal cases. Just this notion that, well, there's an eyewitness, so we know what happened because they tell us what happened. And we just know more and more and more that eyewitness accounts are flawed. Even when you think it should be seared into your brain what happened. Like you said, when it's so chaotic and so many things are happening, you are trying to process it. She's suffering as it is. She's going to go into shock at some point. And she's trying to recount what happened several days later after a survival story of her own, surviving for 3 days in the wilderness with nobody, being found by these kayakers while she's washing her hair in the river, right? I mean, and you're expecting everything she says to be 100% accurate. That's a lot to ask. And the notion that she may have conflated things and sort of multiplied these events and applied them to everybody who's there, I don't think that's a terrible idea.
Yeah, that's a great point, Brett. And we really do see it in our witnesses so much because the brain kind of is doing its best to gather as much information as it can in a split second in a traumatic situation. And then, like you said, she doesn't then turn around and recount it right after coming down the mountainside. It's days later after even more trauma on top of trauma. And we see kind of imperfect memories even in the most perfect of situations, where someone is not in the line of fire, so to speak. They observe something from a safe distance and they turn around and immediately tell the police. And they will get the color of the car wrong, the color of the shirt the suspect was wearing wrong. We see this all the time. And not even under the conditions that Ludmilla was under the conditions that Valia was under. Following these two related but shocking events, maybe the rest of the group just freaked out. It's possible that the first two deaths simply sent the group into a panic. Maybe Sasha did have an aneurysm, which was a natural but shocking cause, and maybe Ludmilla did have a heart attack after seeing, someone she regarded as her son pass away, and she was susceptible to heart attacks, and it was cold, and she hadn't had enough food. Everything contributed to these kind of natural causes, and seeing two of their friends die so suddenly and so violently was just too much for the rest of them to handle. Now, Valia kept her senses and followed the last order she was given and went to the forest, while the rest of the group stayed with their friends and eventually kind of laid down and died from hypothermia. Now, this does require us to discount Valia's story about the others having similar symptoms of blood pouring out of their eyes, etc. But kind of like we've already been discussing, this is probably understandable if Valia didn't really see all of that happen, given what she's gone through. Nevertheless, the fact this theory ignores Valia's story is the biggest strike against it, assuming her testimony is accurate, and we'll get to that later. But this theory is difficult, though, because there is one survivor from the group, and we have only one, so to speak, eyewitness testimony, and it's Valia's. And this theory goes against everything Valia recounts.
So those are sort of the more commonplace theories. And now let's talk about the most popular theory out there, I think, amongst those of us who look at this case and don't think it's hypothermia. And then that's that the group was exposed to some sort of toxic gas. And not only is this one of the most interesting theories, but it's one that makes sense and sort of fits with your common experience of toxic gas, granted, which is from the movies. But it may seem strange at first blush that anyone would be gassing a mountainside where people would be hiking, but that's not exactly the theory. I mean, number one, remember, this is Russia. And if you know anything about the Russians, nowhere was sacred for Russia. They were willing to test things basically anywhere. And the theory is the Russians were testing some sort of toxic agent out in the middle of nowhere. Perhaps VX gas or something called Novichok gas, which the Russians claimed for decades doesn't exist, but it absolutely does exist. It was something that they were able to develop and that they have deployed against various enemies of the state even to this day. Now, these gases, these poisons, they have a unique property. While you might expect them to disperse quickly, one of the reasons they are so dangerous is that they actually persist. In fact, in cold weather, they can persist for months. And while they are called a gas, they are soluble in water. And if contaminated water gets onto a person's skin, serious injury and probable death will occur. But unlike the gas form of these poisons, which act on the body in seconds, the liquid form can take up to 18 hours to have its effect.
That's fascinating. But you would think that the contaminants would be found within the body. But I guess kind of that's the problem with having waited so long to start the search for the bodies is the gases may have, not, I guess at that point they weren't gases, but any toxins may have dissipated by the time the bodies were brought in for an autopsy.
And you have to assume the autopsies would actually report if they did find any of these toxic agents.
Now we're getting into conspiracy land. Now, the Russians certainly developed and tested nerve agents throughout the years. It's known that they tested toxic gases in and around the lakes of Russia, including Baikal. And they were really, really bad at cleaning it up. We know this now. When they tested various diseases on an island in the Aral Sea, people in the surrounding areas suffered outbreaks of things like smallpox and the Black Plague. When the Russians accidentally turned the Aral Sea, the fourth largest lake in the world at the time, into the Aralkum Desert, they left behind a land so poisoned that it is one of the most dangerous places to live in the world.
So you can sort of imagine how this goes. If some toxic substance was responsible for what we're seeing here on Khamar Daban, the theory would go something like this. So the Russians, they're testing something in the area. Possibly it's Novichok. Novichok testing was going on at the time. I have seen people claim that Novichok testing was happening in this area. I was not able to find any sources that specifically said that. The places I found that Novichok testing was taking place were a good ways away from here. But having said that, we do know that Lake Baikal was certainly a place where testing was happening because they found pollutants in Lake Baikal, which basically tell the story that this was happening. And we also know that the testing for Novichok gas actually stopped right around this incident. So it makes you wonder if maybe the reason that it just so happened to stop right after this incident is it had something to do with this. In any event, so imagine they're testing this gas or maybe something else. They once again neglect to clean it up because they think whatever, any residual toxin, not going to be a big deal. This is the middle of nowhere. Even if somebody comes through here, this is not going to affect them. But the thing that they did not expect is the constant rain, which will reactivate the agent. So like we said, it persists. It persists in cold weather. And when water hits it, it reactivates and it becomes water soluble. So you could imagine that all the members of the group are actually affected by this, except Valya. Maybe because she's lucky, maybe because she doesn't get as much on her, or maybe just, the chemistry of her body is different. That's the thing about these toxic gases. They will have different effects on different people. They are very, very deadly, but they don't tend to be 100% deadly. So it's not clear if maybe she just happened to be, if she'd been 1 foot to the right or 1 foot to the left, or if she'd stepped in that puddle that everybody else stepped in, the same thing would have happened to her. Or if she just didn't have as much. But in any event, she's simply lucky. There's a big problem with this theory, though. We've all seen the movies, right? I mean, we've all seen The Rock or whatever, where I think The Rock, they are actually stealing VX gas. And there's a scene in the very beginning of that where they drop like a ball of VX gas and it burst. And one of the guys who's in the group is in the room with the VX gas and it hits him and he like essentially melts, right? And I think our thought about gas like this is that's how it happens. That the gas goes off, you inhale it, and you suddenly are bleeding out of your eyes and bleeding out of your ears and everything else. But in fact, the problem is the poison gas theory, the symptoms don't really match the known agents, the agents that we know about. The bruised lungs are consistent with toxic gas, but that's about it. So most chemical weapons, they don't cause your eyes and ears to bleed. So something like VX gas, for instance, is a nerve agent. It essentially makes your nerves stop working, and so you kind of just die. Your heart no longer works, you no longer breathe, and you die. It doesn't melt you from the inside. So if this were an agent causing this, it would need to be something kind of like methyl isocyanate or a much deadlier version of mustard gas, which is a gas that was developed in World War I. These toxins do cause both lung distress, edema, irritation of the eyes and ears, which can lead to bleeding. But really, the biggest problem here is there's no known agent that would cause this kind of sudden, almost instantaneous effect on the entire group. If everybody had been bitten by a boomslang snake, or they'd all caught Ebola, and they were all hanging out into the tent for a few days, maybe. But if this is the result of a chemical attack, it's an agent that we don't know much about. And really a terrifying one if it could have this kind of mass effect. Essentially, the best I can come up with is some sort of agent which causes hemorrhagic effects that was in the water that had some sort of delayed effect. So they all experienced it at the same time the night before, and it essentially, almost miraculously, all of them suffered the deadly effects at the same time. I don't think this could be a case where they all walked through sort of a cloud of this gas and it affected them this way. That's just not how these toxins tend to work.
Yeah, if that is a toxin that caused this, you're right, that is terrifying. Because can you imagine the chemical warfare? How deadly that could be. Here's another theory, and we've kind of been hinting at this, but let's discuss it more fully. Maybe the blood coming out of the eyes and ears is just made up. The resources on this case largely report that Valia told rescuers about blood pouring from the eyes and ears of the hikers. But what if that's not accurate? Finding sources on this case, like Brett mentioned earlier, is really difficult. But there is a video of the finding of the bodies that purports to have Valia's testimony dubbed over the video, and we've linked to it so you guys can go look at it yourself. And in that video, the scene Valia describes is exceedingly strange, but it's not quite what we've been told. Here is what she says. On August 5th, 10 o'clock in the morning, Kristen, or Sasha, said that they are wet and freezing, and it's snowing, and landmarks are not visible. They collected the backpacks and the tent and began to descend towards the snowy valley. They passed 10 meters. And Sasha began to fall, and he tried to get him up, but he fell again. Now Ludmila remained with him, and the rest were ordered to go down. But almost immediately, Ludmila stopped the group and asked someone to come get her. Tatiana looked up, and she had her tent with her. Now and remember, this is Valia describing it, I went up to Korovina. Sasha's eyes were huge, blank stare. Korovina felt for a pulse and said that his heart was not beating. Okay, then I was asked to drag Vika, remember it's Victoria, down. So I went up to Vika and she bit me. I dragged her the rest of the way. Tatiana began to beat her head into the rocks, and Dennis hid behind the stones and climbed into a sleeping bag. I crawled to Korovina and she was not breathing. I tried to raise Timur. Realizing that no one was moving, I began to go down to the trees. I got dressed and I lay in my sleeping bag covered with a tent. In the morning, I went up and saw Tatiana on the rocks. Dennis, Timur, Vika, Sasha, and Korovina, and none of them rose again. Now, that is a very haunting scene that she describes, but it's not the story that we've been told up to this point. So if this statement is actually what happened, then many of the theories that we have discounted suddenly become viable. The deaths are sudden, but not quite as sudden as otherwise reported. And there's also not this instantaneous massive bleeding from people's eyes and nose that we have heard about. Rather, it sounds like probably some health event got to Sasha, and there was some sort of confusion and chaos and a slower descent into chaos than what was reported originally.
Yeah, it seems just like a mass panic gripped the group. If this is what happened, then something happened to Sasha, though it's not clear entirely what it was, though even he, according to this statement, the bleeding thing is not happening. So maybe he did suffer an aneurysm or something like that. And maybe, Ludmila did have a heart attack, and everybody else just kind of freaks out, right? Like you have one person who's hiding behind a rock and one person who bites her when she's trying to get her to come with her, and one person who's climbing in their sleeping bag. And she's the only one who keeps her head, and she just keeps her head and decides to go down the mountain. And the rest of them, because they don't keep their head and because they are gripped by panic and fear and shock at what they're seeing, do just succumb to hypothermia. And the blood and everything else is just something that's kind of added, much like the missing clothes, to make this story seem more shocking and more exotic and more mysterious than it is, even though it is still mysterious. I mean, this story does not explain everything that happened or why it happened the way it did. Mass panic is a weird thing. It happens. And it can happen to groups where everybody in the group succumbs to mass panic. It's a strange thing. One of those things that's not well understood exactly what happens, but it does happen. Particularly in a situation like this where you have young people and the leaders of the group are suddenly struck down. You can imagine how something like this would happen.
And you can imagine it happening after they haven't had enough food, right? A lot of factors may have contributed to them being susceptible to mass panic. Not having enough food, so their bodies are already not thinking quite clearly, are a bit in shock, maybe are just struggling to keep the basal temperature at a level that sustains life. And they had to deviate from their original plan, which is camp on the side of the mountain, knowing that that wasn't the best choice. And the fact that Vika bites Valia, I think, really points to people not having their faculties about them, right? She is told, Valia is clearly instructed to go help Vika because Vika can't think clearly. That's why she's told to go drag her down, right? It's not to be mean or anything. It's to drag Vika to safety. But instead of seeing help, Vika lashes out kind of in an animalistic or childlike manner.
And it's kind of like, look, those of you who've ever, and I'm just going to say, I'm sure Alice has done this, and if you've ever worked as a lifeguard, one of the things that you learn as a lifeguard is that when you're trying to save someone, they will fight you because they are panicking and they're sort of losing their mind. And there are times when lifeguards have to essentially punch somebody in the face to get them to stop fighting them because they will drown the lifeguard because they're in such panic. And you kind of feel like that's what's happening here, is that she's in such a state of panic that even when Valia comes to help her, she's biting her. That's how much she's panicking, and I think is a sign of what we see going on here.
I mean, heck, you don't even have to be a lifeguard to imagine that situation. Any of us who deal with kind of young children, toddlers, when they're in a frenzy, they want to do something or they're scared about something, they will kick and bite you and you have to physically overcome them. And it sounds like that's what Valia had to do here with Vika. And, one interesting thing is all along we've heard this reporting that Valia said she went back up the next morning after she woke up and realized she was alive, and she went and closed everyone's eyes. That would be a very, it's a heartbreaking image, but she may have done that because these are her friends and she realizes that they are all dead, that they would, in her words, none of them rose again. But if in fact their eyes were all bloody because blood had been pouring out of it, I can imagine that's a very traumatic sight to see. And even though she might not be scared of that, I can imagine she might think twice of sticking her hands where their eyes were maybe covered in blood to close their eyes. And so, everyone reacts differently, but there's no mention of, despite the blood, I went ahead and closed her eyes. Because I would think if there was blood pouring out, the blood would have congealed and you may not even be able to see or reach the eyes in order to close them if they were in fact open.
And so, that might be the sort of logical explanation for what happened. We've poured cold water on this case again. Not as mysterious as you think it was, but hold the phone, not so fast, my friends, as Lee Corso would say. For a very long time, that was all the information we had. We had this initial statement from Valia. We just read it to you, and that was it. She didn't talk to anybody. She got married. She didn't talk to her husband about this. She refused to give interviews. She did not want to relive this. She was in the hospital for a long time. It took her even longer to get mentally right about this. And so that's all we had. But recently, Komsomolskaya Pravda, which you may recall as the newspaper that has also investigated the Dyatlov Pass, they were able to get an interview with Valia where she talked about this case. And in this conversation, she reiterated her story that when the death started, blood was pouring out of the group's noses. Maybe not the eyes and the ears and everything else, but they were bleeding from their noses, all of them. And she actually said she didn't walk down the mountain to the forest. She had to crawl because that was the situation she was in. And the only reason she even made it was Dennis had urged her to go down the mountain. And she did. She crawled all the way to the forest, but Dennis didn't make it. She looked back and Dennis was gone. So she reiterates this story that we've basically just debunked about the blood. Now, she had a possible explanation, an explanation that she believed explained this, and it's not an unusual one. It's just pulmonary edema as a result of the altitude and the cold. Now, symptoms of this include difficulty breathing, extreme shortness of breath that worsens with activity, a feeling of suffocating or drowning, which, remember, people who are struggling to breathe, a cough that produces frothing at the mouth that may be tinged with blood, wheezing and grasping for breath, cold, clammy skin, anxiety, restlessness, apprehension, bluish lips, and irregular heartbeat, and it certainly can be fatal. But you have to imagine, is it possible, we've said this again and again, that all of these people suffered from this condition, pulmonary edema, so suddenly and all at once? Doesn't seem possible unless it was the result of another cause of pulmonary edema, poison gas. So we're back to the gas possibility. But is that really possible? We talked about all the reasons the gas doesn't seem possible. Maybe it is, maybe it's not, but the Pravda investigation uncovered one more interesting fact that makes you reconsider everything that we've learned about in this case. Natalia. We talked about Natalia before. Natalia is Ludmila Korovina's daughter. She was leading another expedition that week that was supposed to meet up with this group. They obviously never did. She also broke her silence, and she revealed for the first time that immediately after her mother and the group were killed, she was summoned to a government office. And there she was offered what she described as a very large sum of money. But it came with one condition. She was never to ask any questions about what happened to her mother and the group. And with her mother gone, she was in desperate need of the money. So she agreed to this condition and took the money. And for 30 years, she remained silent, only finally speaking recently as a result of this investigation. And to me, that makes, going back to the fact it took them so long to launch this investigation, the seeming, the hypothermia not really matching anything we've heard, the unusual symptoms, I wonder if, in fact, even though we may not understand exactly what the Russians were doing on the side of that mountain and what they were testing, that this was the result of some sort of Russian experiment gone wrong, and that's why this ended up going the way it did.
Well, that's a explosive last fact to give. And that's exactly what it was when this fact came out, when Natalia spoke up for the first time. It's hard to understand why this large sum of money would come, because I don't believe they had any sort of a surviving victims fund just to benevolently help people who were in need of money after their loved ones died, right? This did not come from some government fund in that sense. And for it to be tied to the conditions of never ask questions, you can't help but wonder why. Why can't you ask questions?
Yeah, I think, it's much like Dyatlov Pass. There was so much secrecy here. And even though this is at the end of the Cold War, not in the middle of it, to this day, the Russians are doing things you don't want to ask questions about if you're in Russia. And I just feel like they bought her silence because they screwed up. They knew they screwed up, and this happened because of what they did. And I'm not exactly sure how this went down, but I think it is certainly possible, and there are all sorts of reasons to believe this is a natural event. We've talked about, it wasn't like this was a sunny hike that went perfectly and then everybody died. That is not what happened here. There were all sorts of bad things that happened on this hike. And there's all sorts of physical things that happened to this group that weakened them. Now, maybe that's tied into it. They were weaker. They were more susceptible to something like this happening. The rain had reactivated whatever this was, and all of that combined together to cause these sort of sudden deaths. And Valia was just lucky. Or maybe she had eaten a little bit more. Maybe she was just in a little bit better condition. Maybe the water that had the chemical in it, she didn't get it on her, or whatever. I mean, who knows what the exact reason would be. It's also possible, why did this all happen at once? It's possible it happened to Sasha. And when it happened to Sasha, everybody else did panic, and their heart rates increased, and the blood was pumping, and that actually pushed this toxin through their system faster than it would have otherwise. And that's what caused them to start dying the way they did. It wasn't that it all happened at once. It was the excitement of everything just accelerated what was going to happen to them soon thereafter anyway. Difficult to say. I don't know that we'll ever know. I wish we had better autopsy. I wish we could look at these bodies. They were all buried in zinc coffins, which seems to happen whenever we have something like this. The bodies were never released to the families. They were never viewed by the families. Now, they were in pretty bad shape, so you can imagine why, but there was not even an option for the families to have these bodies. The government took care of all that, And I just got to wonder. I don't know if this is another one of those where in some, KGB office or FSB office or whatever acronym they're calling themselves these days, there is a memo that says what happened to this group and why it happened. And maybe one day we'll learn the answer to it. But until then, I think it is going to remain one of the world's great mysteries. Well, I'm sure all of you have lots of thoughts and questions about this case. Shoot us an email at prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all your social media. Check us out on YouTube. Hit us up on Reddit. Join the Patreon and get ad-free episodes, even though you miss out on our awesome ads. I know you guys love so much. It still is something you can do if you are so inclined. And, of course, continue to tell your friends. Continue to leave those 5-star reviews. Well, Alice, as we sail off into the sunset today, do you have anything else you want to add?
I don't, but what an interesting mystery. I really look forward to what you all have to add, because I'm sure there are some scientists or other medically trained people who might have some answers for us. And if we hear from you, we'd love to do a follow-up episode.
Absolutely. So please do send us in any information you have. We can't wait to read it. Well, this has been a fun diversion from the ordinary true crime to one of the world's great mysteries. But we'll be back to true crime next week with a new case, new questions, and new answers. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors.
Talk with confidence. What do you think?
With confidence. How does it look when you talk with confidence on your...
It seems like it's at 12. I try to keep it at 12, but I must not be doing a great job. So.
That's fine. You can be going higher than 12. It's fine. Okay. As long as the main thing is, you don't want to be super loud. Like if your little peaks are going beyond or you can see them, that's a problem.
Okay.
But, it really needs to be no less than 12. So
okay.
if you can get it past 12, that's
at
better.
12. I'm doing it now. Woo!
Yeah. It's okay. Done that one. Never have to do that one again.
No, he did a really good job on that.
This one's Sharivna, so that's pretty easy. I can do that one. Sharivna. Okay, you ready?
I'm ready.